Let me start off because I think we are slowly overcoming some of the difficulties, and this remains one of the difficulties. Let me just start off with what this law is capable of doing to India. This law essentially says you've had the earlier land acquisition law from 1894 to 2014. So what was a law which provided for an inadequate compensation worked itself for 120 years. Now in those 120 years, the law needed to be reformed, but India's agricultural production didn't come down. You had acquisitions of land, you had creations of urban centers, you had industries, you had infrastructure. But India's agriculture growth, the quantums grew year after year. So the simple proposition that if you acquire land for infrastructure, India's food security would be challenged is belied by the fact that it didn't happen in the 120 years that the earlier law was in existence. Despite that law, we grew year after year. The architecture of the new law was that if the state wants land and it's a power which is eminent domain, the sovereign power of the state, you have 65% of the people without adequate housing, you have low quality infrastructure, you have a huge amount of industrialization yet to take place. From hospital to a graveyard, you need land for every activity. And suddenly you had a law which made acquisition not difficult, but I would say impossible. The first part of the law was that if you want to acquire land, 70 or 80%, depending on the case, percent of the landowners must give you a written consent that they want land. Now it's hardly likely that people are voluntarily going to give you consent, please come and acquire my land. Thereafter, you will impact, does it socially impact on people, the loss of land? Of course it will. It will lead to a change of profession. So if it does, you can't acquire it. The third hurdle is, will it lead to lowering the food productivity? It could well be argued that at least on this piece of land it would. It's only then that you can start the process of acquisition. I asked the framers of the law, do you seriously believe that any piece of land can be acquired under this law? And they said, no, it can't be. How will then India grow? The answer is, well, you buy agricultural land, go to the chief ministers, use all kinds of methods, fair or foul, persuade him to change the user of the land. And that has been one of the biggest malpractices that has taken place in India. Now, it was this mindset, and I'm only giving an illustrative example. Let me give another example. If one picks up and reads the correspondence between the then Prime Minister and the then Telecom Minister when the spectrum was being auctioned, you knew that the Prime Minister, you can read between the lines that the Prime Minister knew that there is foul play which is on. This very simple answer is, please go in for a process of auctioning. It's a natural resource. The state will get money. Nobody will come to the Prime Minister, nobody will come to the Minister, no ministers will go to the jails, no Prime Minister will ever be summoned by a court for misusing a discretion. So please do it by a transparent market mechanism. But there was a sense of helplessness in doing so. With regard to coal, the former Prime Minister announced the decision that it must go by auction within 2 months of becoming a Prime Minister. Until for 10 years when he relinquished office, you still didn't have an auction. In fact, I am given to understand that the party in power used to issue chits, and whoever got that slip for a collateral consideration got the land, got the mine. So I told somebody that this was another form of the chit fund scandal in India. That you give chits and get a fund and the mines go in the process. This is exactly what was happening. Now, how do we allow this system to continue? The same with regard, our mineral law says, which was framed when nobody had a demand for Indian mineral, because there was no industry, or there was inadequate industry. So you were wanting people to come in and take the mining rights. So the law which was then drafted by the British said, well, let it be done on a first come, first serve basis, because nobody comes to ask for mineral here. Whoever comes, let us lump it to them. But in 2014 and 2010, India had changed. The world wanted this valuable mineral. Our own industry wanted it. The actual users wanted it. The state wanted it. What is it exactly that Prime Minister Modi's government is trying to do in all this? So in the land acquisition law, we are saying please pay them 4 times the market compensation. There is no difficulty. The farmers must get their due. The law had 13 exceptions to this onerous procedure. We've added 5 more. What are the 5? The defense and security of India. Now, under the present law, if land is required for India's defense, security, nuclear, strategic programs, there is no provision in this act for getting it. I was given the responsibility, additional charge of the Defense Ministry for about a couple of months. And one of the most difficult cases I came across was that we needed land for strategic purposes. Now, we can't disclose the purpose of acquisition. We can't disclose where those installations are going to be made. And then I looked the act 5 times over and backwards, and there was no provision in this act for allowing me any exemption. So I must first have a social impact assessment. I must have 80% people signing as to whether their private rights are on a higher footing or the defense and security of India should be taken at a higher range. One of the most successful programs Mr. Vajpayee launched was the Rural Roads Program. We call it the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. Now, under this act for rural infrastructure, rural roads, irrigation, rural electrification, no land can be acquired. So India's villages will continue to live in darkness without roads, without irrigation. Irrigation is not an exempted purpose. And one of the biggest challenges to get India out of poverty is to spend a lot more money into irrigation. And one of the factors that I regret, even in the present budget, that if I had more money in my pocket, that's one area I would have liked to spend more. But with this law in place, I can't spend that money because irrigation projects, land cannot be allotted. The law is so unrealistic. 5% of people without housing have to come into urban, semi-urban areas. From huts and village homes, they aspire for better. Low-cost housing and affordable housing is not an exempted purpose. That's the 4th purpose. Now, all these are purposes which are going to help the en masse shifting and the improvement in the quality of life of rural India. One of the purposes is industrial corridors. Now, just as the Delhi-Mumbai corridor is being built, when you build a corridor, it's a narrow corridor, 500 meters or 1 kilometer on either side of the road. The entire rural area on both sides gets developed. Their land values go up. Infrastructure, at least cities have some infrastructure, the villages have no infrastructure. That's where it's to be built. So each one of these exempted purposes is going to help rural India. Waging ideological battle between reform and obstruction. And as far as obstruction is concerned, the only object seems to be some form of a sadistic thrill which is there in every obstruction. I prevented so and so. But then the government is fairly determined, and I think one of the great tests our government is passing through is, do we waver? Do we blink? And if we show any signs of blinking, then the sadistic thrill reaches a higher level. And that is something which I think the crisis that Prime Minister Modi faced a decade ago, he demonstrated that he had sufficient grit and he never blinked. And I'm quite certain the government is not going to blink on this.